Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. A $500 fine for having a flower bed. The ink wasn't even dry before the HOA president smirked, thinking he'd won. What he didn't know was that he had just fined a Supreme Court judge, and I don't lose. William Grant leaned against his porch railing, holding the crisp notice in his hand. His backyard, bathed in the golden afternoon sun, was nothing short of pristine. Manicured hedges, a neatly trimmed lawn, and a flower bed filled with vibrant roses his late wife had adored. And yet, this fine, a ridiculous demand, was the first greeting he received from the HOA. He turned his gaze toward the street, where a stocky man in a polo shirt and khaki shorts strutted around like he owned the place. Richard Langley, HOA president, the kind of man who wielded the homeowner's rulebook like a weapon, preying on anyone who dared challenge his authority. He stood beside a golf cart, clipboard in hand, issuing more citations to neighbors with that smug, self-satisfied grin. William stepped off his porch, calm but determined. "Excuse me," he said, holding up the fine. "Mind explaining what this is about?" Richard barely spared him a glance before answering, "Unauthorized flower beds. Page 12 of the HOA Guidelines. Landscaping modifications require approval." William raised a brow. "Flower beds require approval? Since when?" "Since always," Richard replied, tapping his clipboard. "It's standard practice. Got to keep the neighborhood uniform. You should have read the rules before moving in." "I did," William said, his voice even. "And there's nothing about flower beds requiring pre-approval." Richard chuckled. "You a lawyer or something?" William let a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Something like that." Richard crossed his arms. "Look, rules are rules. You can pay the fine or file an appeal, but I wouldn't waste your time." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if imparting a great secret. "I never lose." William met his gaze, unflinching. "Is that so?" Richard smirked. "It is." William nodded, folding the fine neatly. "Good to know." That evening, he poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat at his desk, flipping through the HOA bylaws he had printed before moving in. His legal instincts had been right. There was no rule about flower beds requiring approval. But what intrigued him more were the inconsistencies. A pattern emerged. Fines seemed to be arbitrarily enforced. His flower bed was an issue, but Richard's own overgrown hedges and mismatched mailbox weren't. A neighbor's American flag was too large, but another's garden gnome army went untouched. William leaned back in his chair, a familiar thrill running through him. It had been a while since he felt the tug of a real challenge. The next morning, William made a stop at Richard's house, noting with amusement the multiple violations visible from the sidewalk. "Morning," William greeted, holding up his coffee. Richard, halfway into his golf cart, frowned. "Something I can do for you, Grant?" "Thought I'd take your advice and read the rulebook," William said, pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "Seems like a few things are unevenly enforced." Richard's jaw tightened. "Where are you getting at?" "Just that your hedges are a foot too tall according to Section 3.5. Your mailbox is an HOA standard, and your driveway has an oil stain that should have earned you a fine weeks ago." William's eyes twinkled with mischief. Strange how these things go unnoticed. Richard stiffened. "Are you threatening me?" "Not all," William said smoothly, just making an observation. Richard's smug expression wavered for the first time. "You don't want to start a war you can't win." William took a slow sip of his coffee. "Oh, Richard," he said, voice rich with amusement. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." By noon, a new fine landed on Richard's doorstep, this time from his own HOA board. William leaned back in his chair, watching through his office window as Richard Langley stomped toward his golf cart, the fresh violation notice crumpled in his fist. The HOA president's usual smug demeanor had cracked, replaced with barely contained frustration. It was the first sign that William's subtle pushback had landed. A few hours later, William attended his first HOA meeting, walking into the community clubhouse with quiet confidence. The room was filled with a mix of indifferent homeowners and a few who looked genuinely anxious. At the front sat Richard, flanked by the rest of the HOA board, three middle-aged yes-men who nodded at whatever Richard said. "All right," Richard began, slamming his gavel onto the table for no reason other than to assert dominance. Next on the agenda, a violation dispute. Mr. Grant, you're here to contest your fine? William stood, smoothing his sleeves. Yes, and I'd like to begin by just to be clear. Richard cut in, flashing a condescending smile. This isn't a court of law, Judge. This is an HOA hearing, different rules. A few people snickered. William nearly smiled. He'd seen this type before. Men who mistook unchecked power for intelligence. I'm aware, Mr. Langley, William said, but rules still matter. I've read the HOA bylaws. Nowhere does it say flower beds require pre-approval. Richard smirked, flipping open a folder. Page 12. All exterior modifications require prior approval. William raised a brow. That's referring to major structural changes such as fences, sheds, and patios. A flower bed is not a structure. Agree to disagree, Richard said smugly, but the fine stands. William chuckled. You're free to disagree. The law, however, is not. Richard's smirk faltered. Before he could respond, a woman from the audience spoke up. Actually, he's right. I've lived here 10 years. I've never had to ask permission for a flower bed. A murmur spread through the room. Others nodded. Richard's eyes flickered with annoyance. That's not up for discussion. The fine remains. He tapped his gavel again. Next issue. William could see it now. This wasn't just arbitrary enforcement. This was intentional targeting. Richard thrived on power, picking homeowners apart. Owners who wouldn't fight back. Unfortunately for him, William wasn't one of them. That evening, William began collecting evidence. He took photos of Richard's own violations. Overgrown hedges, faded house paint, and unauthorized deck extensions. Then he walked the neighborhood, speaking to other homeowners who had been unfairly fined. A pattern emerged. Richard targeted newcomers or those who spoke out, while longtime residents in his inner circle were left alone. Certain people paid thousands in fines for minor infractions, while others had glaring violations ignored. The next day, Williams submitted a formal complaint against Richard. A compliance officer, a man who clearly hated working under Richard, begrudgingly inspected the violations. By the afternoon, Richard received a $750 fine for non-compliant landscaping. The neighborhood buzzed with quiet amusement. That evening, William relaxed on his porch, sipping bourbon, when Richard stormed up his driveway, fuming. You think this is funny? Richard spat, waving the violation notice. William set down his glass. Not at all. Rules are rules. Richard's face turned red. You're making a mistake. William tilted his head. Because I'm following the rules. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. I run this HOA. If you keep pushing, I will make your life miserable. William's lips curved into a slow smile. You already have, Richard, and that was your mistake. The next morning, William woke up to 6 more fines. One for his mailbox, one for the color of his window trim, one for the height of his fence, another for a non-approved bird feeder, and 2 more for reasons so absurd he laughed out loud. This wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about control, and Richard just declared war. William sat at his desk, sipping his morning coffee, flipping through the fresh stack of violation notices with an amused smirk. Richard had gone nuclear, fining him for a bird feeder. The man was desperate, but desperation led to mistakes, and mistakes were what William thrived on. He turned to his laptop and opened the HOA's financial records. As a Supreme Court judge, he had seen his fair share of corruption, and something about Richard's HOA felt off. Fines were meant to be a minor enforcement measure, not a full-scale revenue stream. Yet, based on homeowner complaints, Richard was handing out thousands of dollars in penalties. But where was that money going? Most HOAs used fine money for community maintenance, upkeep, repairs, and landscaping. But looking around the neighborhood, where was the improvement? The roads had cracks, the pool was closed for repairs for months, and the clubhouse looked outdated. Something wasn't adding up. William dug deeper, accessing the HOA's annual budget reports. His legal background allowed him to navigate financial documents with ease. After an hour of cross-referencing incoming fines versus HOA expenses, his suspicions were confirmed. Over 40% of the collected fines were unaccounted for, tens of thousands of dollars missing. Leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Bingo! William wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president. He was dealing with a thief, and that changed everything. That afternoon, William took a walk around the neighborhood, casually chatting with homeowners. Many had stories. One elderly couple had been fined $1,200 for a slightly off-white garage door. A single mother was forced to pay $500 for a non-compliant security camera, despite other homes having the exact same model. A military veteran had almost lost his home after being fined into financial hardship over yard debris, a single fallen branch. William documented everything. Then he paid a visit to a local investigative journalist he had worked with years ago, Langley. The journalist, Dan Matthews, said, raising an eyebrow, "I know that name. There was a small case years back. He was caught embezzling funds from a previous HOA, but got off with a settlement." William's lips curled. Perfect. The next day, William put Phase 2 into action. He submitted an official request for HOA financial transparency, citing legal precedent. The HOA was legally required to provide a breakdown of their finances to homeowners upon request. Quest Richard, of course, refused. Instead, he fined William again, $1,000 for a visibly cracked driveway. William simply smiled, waiting for Richard to make his next mistake. And Richard did. 2 nights later, under the cover of darkness, Richard personally spray-painted William's driveway with fake cracks and then issued a fine for it the next morning. Unfortunately for Richard, William had security cameras. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Word had spread fast. People were fed up. Richard walked in, wearing his usual smug expression, but there was tension in the air. William sat near the front, a thick folder in hand. Richard cleared his throat, tapping his gavel. "Before we start, I want to address some concerns about fines. These rules exist for a reason, and homeowners need to—" William stood up. "Actually, Richard, let's talk about your rules." Richard tensed. "You don't have the floor." "I do now," William replied, pulling a stack of papers from his folder. "I've compiled a detailed analysis of your financial records, and guess what? Over 40% of the collected HOA fines are missing." A murmur spread through the crowd. William continued, "Not only that, but your own violations have gone unpunished for years. Your hedge is too high, your deck extension unauthorized, your driveway stained. You fine residents thousands of dollars for nonsense while lining your own pockets." Richard turned pale. "That's ridiculous." William smirked. "Oh, and let's not forget this." He pulled out photos of Richard spray painting his driveway. Gasps filled the room. Richard froze. "You vandalized my property to justify a fine," William said smoothly. "That's fraud. That's illegal." Richard bolted from the meeting, but it was too late. By morning, the entire neighborhood knew the truth. By evening, the police, Richard Langley, was a cornered animal. And William knew at the moment the HOA president stormed out of the meeting, panic flashing across his face. William leaned back in his chair, listening to the murmur of angry homeowners rising around him. For years, Richard had ruled with an iron fist, bullying, fining, and manipulating his way to power. But now the mask had cracked. By morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with what had been exposed: embezzled funds, fraudulent fines, and now outright vandalism. William had all the proof he needed, but now it was time for the finishing blow. Richard didn't back down easily. The next morning, William woke up to a certified letter from the HOA. He chuckled as he read the latest desperate maneuver: final notice of foreclosure proceedings. Richard had weaponized one of the HOA's most aggressive tactics, threatening to foreclose on William's home over unpaid fines. It was a classic bully move. If he couldn't win fairly, he'd try to scare William into submission. Unfortunately for Richard, he had just made his final mistake. By noon, William was seated at his desk, drafting an official lawsuit. He filed 2 cases: a civil lawsuit against Richard personally for fraud, defamation, and damages, and a lawsuit against the HOA for violating homeowners' rights, financial mismanagement, and wrongful fines. Then he made a single phone call. It rang twice before a voice answered, State Attorney's Office. William smiled. I have a case of HOA corruption that you might find interesting. That evening, William stepped onto his porch, sipping a fresh glass of bourbon, waiting. At exactly 6:45 p.m., Richard's car screeched into his driveway. Showtime. Richard stormed up the walkway, face red, sweat on his forehead. He was unraveling. "You think you're smart?" he spat, waving the foreclosure notice in his hand. "You think you could just waltz into my neighborhood and challenge me?" William chuckled, sipping his drink. "Richard, this was never your neighborhood. You just acted like it was. You're going to lose." Richard hissed. "I have the board, I have the rules. You're just a Supreme Court judge." William interrupted, smirking. Richard flinched. William tossed a folder onto the porch table. "You really should have done your homework before picking this fight. See, I filed 2 lawsuits against you. You can read the details yourself, but long story short, you're about to be financially and legally ruined." Richard grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages, his breathing growing rapid. "Oh, and one more thing," William said casually, taking another sip of his bourbon. "You remember the missing HOA funds? Turns out, so does the state attorney. They'll be investigating you for embezzlement." Richard went completely still. William smiled. "Now you can keep pretending you're untouchable, or you can resign before this gets worse." For the first time, Richard had no comeback. The next morning, a formal resignation letter from Richard was sent to every homeowner by noon. An emergency HOA meeting was held. By evening, Richard Langley was officially removed from the HOA, but William wasn't done yet. He still had one last move to play. The resignation letter was supposed to be Richard's escape plan, a desperate attempt to slip away quietly before the full force of the law caught up with him. But William knew better. This wasn't over, not until Richard faced real consequences for years of fraud, bullying, and abuse of power. As the news of Richard's resignation spread, homeowners celebrated. Some had been victims of his unfair fines for years. Others had almost lost their homes due to his financial extortion. Now, for the first time in a long while, there was hope. But William wasn't celebrating yet. The state attorney's office had already opened an investigation into the missing HOA funds. William had provided all the necessary documents: bank transfers, falsified budgets, proof that Richard had used the money to pay off personal debts, vacations, and luxury expenses. And now it was time for the final blow. The next HOA meeting was the most packed one in years. Homeowners who had never bothered attending suddenly wanted front row seats to Richard Langley's downfall. The interim HOA president, a nervous woman named Linda Carter, took the podium. "With Richard Langley's resignation, we will be voting on new leadership." The doors slammed open, and 2 uniformed officers strode inside, heading straight for the front. Murmurs spread across the room, then whispers, then gasps. The officers stopped beside Richard, who had been sitting in the audience, looking pale and disheveled. "Richard Langley," one officer asked. Richard slowly stood, his jaw tightening. "Yes, you're under arrest for fraud, financial mismanagement, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." The room exploded in noise. Some homeowners cheered. Others just watched in stunned silence as Richard was handcuffed right there in the community clubhouse. As the officers led him toward the exit, Richard's eyes locked onto William. William simply raised his glass in a silent toast. Checkmate. With Richard gone, the HOA board members scrambled to distance themselves. Some had been complicit. Others had just been too spineless to challenge Richard's tyranny. Either way, their time was up. William presented his findings to the community. Every fine issued in the past 3 years was fraudulent, and homeowners were legally owed refunds. The HOA's bylaws had been illegally altered to favor Richard's control. The result? The HOA collapsed in a landslide vote. The homeowners chose to dissolve the association entirely. The bylaws were rewritten, fines were refunded, and the neighborhood took back control. And just like that, the house of cards Richard had built came crashing down. A month later, William sat on his porch, enjoying the sight of his fully restored flower bed. No fines, no HOA letters, no power-hungry tyrant trying to control his every move. A few neighbors strolled by, offering waves and grateful nods. He had changed the neighborhood forever. Then his phone buzzed. It was a text from his journalist contact, Dan. Matthews Langley took a plea deal, 3 years in prison. Thought you'd like to know. William smirked. Justice had been served. As he leaned back in his chair, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe retirement wouldn't be so boring after all. With Richard Langley behind bars, the neighborhood felt newly alive. There were no more surprises, fines, no more threats of foreclosure, and no more ridiculous HOA rules being enforced on a whim. It was as if a weight had been lifted. Homeowners who once lived in fear of minor infractions now took pride in their properties again. American flags waved freely, security cameras went up without harassment, and for the first time in years, people actually enjoyed their homes. The dissolution of the HOA had been swift. With Richard gone and his former allies scattered like cockroaches in the light, the remaining board members resigned within days of his arrest. The community came together to vote on what would replace the oppressive system, and the decision was unanimous: no HOA. Instead, a simple neighborhood council was formed, focusing only on actual community needs: road repairs, security concerns, and maintaining public spaces. The homeowners, now free from Richard's tyranny, began working together instead of against each other. William watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had fought countless legal battles, but this one felt personal. Despite the victory, William still had one final piece of business to take care of: the refunds. Richard had scammed the community out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines. Many homeowners had been left struggling financially because of his greedy abuse of power. Now that the HOA was gone, the money had to be returned. William worked with a small group of neighbors to review every fine issued over the last 5 years. He compiled a list of homeowners who had overpaid or been wrongfully charged, ensuring they received full refunds. For some, it was just a few hundred. For others, it was life-changing. The elderly couple who had been unfairly fined for their garage door received a check for $1,200. The single mother who had been forced to pay for a non-compliant security camera was refunded $500. The military veteran who had almost lost his home over a single fallen branch got back every penny Richard had taken from him. For William, this was true justice. It wasn't just the homeowners getting their money back. Richard himself was forced to contribute as part of his plea deal. The state attorney's office seized his assets, his home, his car, his bank accounts, all liquidated to pay restitution to the very people he had tormented. The same neighbors Richard had threatened now lined up to receive their refunds, watching with satisfaction as his ill-gotten wealth was returned. William didn't attend the hearing where Richard was officially sentenced to 3 years in prison. He didn't need to. He had already won. A month later, William sat on his porch, a glass of bourbon in hand, watching as the neighborhood flourished. There were no more passive-aggressive violation letters. No one had to measure their grass with a ruler or worry about a power-hungry bureaucrat finding them into oblivion. Instead, people started decorating their homes as they pleased. Gardens flourished, and kids played in the streets again. One afternoon, as William was tending to his beloved flower bed, a familiar voice called out, "Hey, Judge." He turned to see his neighbor Tom grinning as he walked up the driveway. "You hear the latest?" Tom asked, shaking his head with amusement. "Some folks from another HOA a few miles from here reached out. They want to know if you'd be willing to help them take down their corrupt board." William chuckled, dusting off his hands. "Guess I've got a reputation now." Tom smirked. "So you in?" William thought for a moment. He had moved here for peace and quiet, but maybe retirement wasn't meant to be boring after all. He picked up his glass, taking a slow sip. "Tell them," he said with a knowing smile. "I'll take a look at their case." The screen fades to black, leaving viewers with a final thought. They think they can push people around, but power in the wrong hands always leads to downfall. What's your craziest HOA story? Drop in the comments. Like and subscribe for more wild tales of justice.